people of the area lived, worked and played and established a tremendous interdependency.
Just as today, there were always people of many faiths, many cultures, who lived here. It was quite commonplace.
The girls, of course, would chalk their peaver beds on the pavement and play peavers, and they had their skipping rhymes. It was a street life of great liveliness and activity.
Nelson's the printers, which families, if the mother or the father had worked there, the families followed them. And it was the same with Usher's Brewery, Mackay's Brewery. The families all followed the fathers into there.
The employment has gone from the area, and we now have the remains of a residential community.
And you saw gradually the area being demolished and really looking very, very sad.
Edinburgh's south side lies between the Cowgate to the north and stretches from the Meadows in the south to Holyrood Park in the east and to Candlemaker Row and Edinburgh's Royal Infirmary in the west. Until the 16th century, the city was mainly built around the closes and courts that stretched from the castle to the palace, the Royal Mile, which lay within the Flodden Wall, built to protect the citizens from the English following the defeat of the Scottish army at the Battle of Flodden in 1513. The two ancient routes into Edinburgh from the south were via the Potter Row and the Pleasance. The first major expansion of Edinburgh was along the Potter Row, where houses were built by a colony of potters and weavers. The first part of Edinburgh's Georgian New Town was around George Square, which was built in 1766 by George Brown. During the 18th century, 19th century and early 20th century, thousands of tenements were built in the south side to relieve overcrowding and the clearance of slum dwellings in the city's old town. By the 1930s, the south side had a population that exceeded 50,000 inhabitants. Most of the houses were privately rented, and the council had built 300 good quality flats as part of the slum clearance and overcrowding programme. Homes fit for heroes had been the slogan at the end of the Great War. In that time, Britain was a great manufacturing force in world economics, and the south side was the location of hundreds of businesses, from the small to the large. Engineering, printing, brewing, sweet and biscuit making, and distilling were all present. A strong sense of community existed, a community which was multicultural in its composition. The strength of the area was its diversity. The south side is the home of two major institutions, the Royal Infirmary and the University of Edinburgh. Following the end of the Second World War, Edinburgh had largely escaped the attentions of the Luftwaffe. Unlike other British cities, damage was minimal. However, by the early 1960s, the south side was beginning to show visible signs of being threatened by the expansion of the university and the hospital, and the motor car, with major new roads being proposed. In a 20-year period, the south side's survival was under threat as planners and developers tried to undo the area's rich heritage and identity.
The 1960s was a terrible time for planning everywhere, not just in Edinburgh. There was a piece of legislation in force that created areas known as comprehensive development areas. And these allowed local authorities to designate large sections of our towns to be comprehensively redeveloped. Never mind what was there, people's homes, shops, offices, businesses of all kinds, institutions, the designation of a comprehensive development area allowed compulsory purchase of property, demolition, and whatever the local authority wished to do. Edinburgh Corporation and Edinburgh University and a property company cooperated to designate the Edinburgh University Comprehensive Redevelopment Area, which extended from George Square over to beyond Nicholson Street and from Buccleuch Place down towards Potter Row and Lothian Street. This allowed the university and the corporation to destroy an enormous area of the historic south side of Edinburgh.
So my introduction to the South Side, although I didn't know it as the South Side at the time, was being at university and watching this amazing destruction and development going on. It was the time when, well, the David Hume Tower had been built, but the Appleton Tower was being built at that time, and all the buildings in George Square were just about to be built.
The university was intent on gobbling up everything up to what was then going to be the roads.
But my recollections of it go back to an area of beautiful triangles and little streets. I think they weren't beautiful to live in because lots of them were very neglected and derelict, but Parker's Triangle was still vibrant and Marshall Street was still a real street. And the place was full of small shops and ordinary shops and pubs. I suppose a nice part of town, but declining.
When it was proposed to build what was called the Eastern Link Road. Now, the Eastern Link Road is something that it's almost incredible to think of today, but I'll describe it to you. It was a 6-lane highway, and it was to go along Dalkeith Road, then down the Pleasance, through St Mary's Street, across the Royal Mile, down Jeffrey Street, over the Waverley Station, I'm not inventing this, and then through a tunnel on the Carlton Hill and ending up at a huge roundabout at the top of Leith Walk. And of course the roundabout, that was the only thing that was ever built. It was there till a few years ago. And this huge great plan, of course, a huge great proposal for this highway would have destroyed a large part of the south side. Now, this proposal for the Eastern Link Road fitted in with the plans that the university had. So the Highways Department and the university were together in this with the old Edinburgh Corporation, which was in those days in charge. And what the university wanted was to clear all the buildings between George Square and the Pleasance, or between George Square and this great big 6-lane highway when it was built, so that they would all have been down and the south side would, in fact, have disappeared.
Well, I've had a great interest in the South Side in a number of capacities, most importantly of all as a resident. Most of the time I lived in Edinburgh, it was always in the South Side. Indeed, at one point I lived at 23B George Square, which is the remaining side of George Square after the substantial destruction of it. But also as a student, I was president of the SRC, and we were very much involved in the debate about the development of the university and protested as students very strongly to Sir Edward Appleton, the Chancellor, the Vice-Chancellor, and to the University Court about the developments that were taking place, particularly the destruction of George Square and the building of these appalling tower blocks to replace what was a beautiful part of the city of Edinburgh.
In the 1960s, the South Side had two problems that were very typical of what was happening in other British cities at the time. Firstly, the planners thought that everybody wanted to leave the city centre and go and live on schemes on the outside of the city. Secondly, of course, and this was peculiar to Edinburgh, the then council wanted to build a motorway system through the city centre and destroy it in the same way as they did to other main cities like Birmingham or Glasgow.
One by one, all the streets in Charles Street, Potter Row, also came under the demolition men. And really, a thriving, bustling area was really metamorphosed into an urban wasteland.
At the same time, of course, in the 1960s, a lot of the traditional industries that were where now New Arthur Place is and throughout the South Side were beginning to decline. And you saw the whole industrial pattern in Edinburgh beginning to change. We never had that much manufacturing industry, but what little we had started to go.
I'm personally very angry, and so must many people be, that that whole chunk of the territory, which was known as Parker's Triangle, but much bigger than that, was destroyed, just physically demolished, with the promise that it was needed for a state-of-the-art dental school and dental hospital. And these promises, of course, have come to nothing. And what is it now, and has been for 20 years, but a car park?
Areas like Drummond Street were full of vacant tenement flats. And another example was that a very nice tenement property in Marshall Street came under the threat of a demolition order. It was a time when the answer to the structural problems in tenement buildings was to demolish them and build new.
I remember that the town clerk, Mr. Glendinning, asking the environmental health officer why the houses had to come down, and he said because they were unfit. Why are they unfit? Because they have not got exclusive use of a WC. What is the normal treatment for a house that has not got exclusive use of a WC? Yeah, pull it down. And that was the sort of level of thinking carried out by Edinburgh Corporation in the 1960s.
A lot of the houses were really run down, so we decided we would start a tenants group, which was East Cross Causeway, The Pleasance, and Howden Street and Davy Street. And that was the way I really got involved to start fighting to get the Southside back to what it used to be.
By the early 1970s, in the Southside, as in other inner city communities, new ideas were emerging.
The politics of the Southside in those days was dominated by plans for redevelopment. Redevelopment which involved clearing the houses, replacing them with roads, university buildings, museums, in fact, just about anything but housing. And the big fight that we had during that period, I guess from about 1970 through to 1975, was to try and turn around that whole approach to the centre of Edinburgh and to the south side, from being one of clearing it out as a residential area and preserving it as a residential area. And those early years in the 70s were tremendously important in that they did represent a turning point.
I think that the voice of the people did make itself heard, and pressure groups were set up, and that transmitted itself to the planners and to the councillors of the time, although as far as I was concerned, they were always pushing an open door, because that was precisely the way that I felt myself.
The Southside Association, of course, I believe has been the mainstay in developing and starting the movement and developing the regeneration of the Southside. And I remember people like John Ross and Peter Farrow and others who really got it going and built it up into a active and vibrant community association with a growing vibrancy in the community. For too long, the Southside had been taken over by the university, and a lot of people moved out to the peripheral areas of Edinburgh. And in the 70s and 80s, I think there was the regeneration, the rebuilding of people living in the South Side, and the Southside Association played a large part in that.
There was only one street actually in the South Side which was totally jerry-built, which hadn't actually fallen down, because the penny tenement, of course, had already collapsed of its own accord. But of the streets still standing when the campaign started, Forbes Street was the only one which had been jerry-built. And it didn't have really particularly solid foundations. It had been put up at the end of the 19th century, and it would have been demolished. But the other buildings on St Leonard Street, unfortunately, were knocked down to make way for the road. Had they survived today, they were perfectly good stone-built buildings, would have been done up inside and would have provided perfectly good housing on a modern standard.
Edinburgh became involved in this drive